Let's get joined up. I'm Wayne Kelly, and this episode is sponsored by Picklock Publishing, the imprint behind my debut novel, Safe Hands, which tells the story of Mickey Blake, a retired safecracker pulled out of retirement for one last job, and Hazel, a desperate mother driven to kill to protect her son from being sucked into a life of crime. It's out now on Kindle, paperback and audiobook, and if you use the link in the show notes, you can get a free 30-day trial of Audible and listen to the book for free. That's Safe Hands by me, W.A. Kelly. Right, advertising done. Let's crack on with the show. Now where's that jingle? Joined up writing. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 225, which is a lovely interview with Jamie West, author of the theatre-themed Bertie Carroll Mysteries series. We got to chat about the similarities between the life of an actor and a writer, which means, of course, dealing with lots of rejection and striving for that lucky break.
And ultimately, the whole thing just comes down to good luck and timing. If your book happens to land on an agent's desk or a publisher's desk at the exact same time, they happen to be looking for something just like that, then boom, you're in, you've won.
We also discover the book that saved his life and hear why he thinks writers can either be painters or sculptors and which one of those he considers himself to be. Before we get to that, a quick update from me. It's been a little manic here. Last episode I talked about my deadline to finish my messy first draft by the end of August. Well, whilst I more than hit the word count target that I set for myself, where I expected the novel to end, I've got to come clean and say that as I record this, I still haven't actually got to the end of the draft. The story is bigger than I thought, and there are more POV characters in this book than in Safe Hands, which means more threads to satisfyingly bring together and just a very big messy thing to wrangle, really. I know where I'm going, and I continue to write lots of words every day, so I'm not slacking off, honest, but I still think it will be a few more days before I can officially type the end on draft 1. I've got beta readers and my mentor booked in to read the first readable version of the book at the beginning of October. So there really isn't any room for error. I need to get to the end, give it a few days to sit, and then jump back in to make it readable for my first readers. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, at the minute, the text is littered with square brackets that include comments like, need to know model of alarm here, research this, check timeline, and even, in some cases, funny metaphor here. So whilst I'll be checking the structure hangs together, I'll also be doing all the, let's call it building maintenance, to make sure the manuscript can actually make sense to other people. Aside from that, last week I put on my self-publishing for beginners workshop, which I really enjoyed. It was a great bunch of talented writers, and their enthusiasm and positive feedback after the course has convinced me to look for a venue to repeat the course in Birmingham before the end of the year. And, as mentioned before, there'll also be an online video version of that course coming soon, and I've got some other things in the pipeline as well, so stay tuned for all of that. And the best way to do that is to sign up to my monthly newsletter over at waynekellywrites.com. You'll also get a free ebook with 2 new crime stories. And in the meantime, I'd just love to hear from you. What are your writing plans, and have you got any projects in the works? Are you facing some challenges that you want to vent about? Well, I love to hear from you, and I always reply, so drop me a line, wayne@waynekellywrites.com, and let me know. Right, let's get to today's interview with Jamie West. Jamie is the West End's resident murder mystery author. He's worked backstage on countless shows in London's West End. He's worked on tons of famous shows, in fact, including The Book of Mormon, Miss Saigon, Kinky Boots, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, Dear Evan Hansen, and even Hamilton, just to name a few. As you'll hear, a love of theatre history and a good murder mystery is what inspired his Bertie Carroll series set in 1930s Theatreland. His first novel, Death on the Pier, was published in October 2022, going on to become an Amazon bestseller and Chat Magazine's Book of the Month. And Murder at the Matinee, the second in the series, is out everywhere right now. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end to wrap things up. Brilliant. Okay, Jamie, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So just to start us off, why don't you give us a sense of where you're speaking from in the world at the minute and how things are going in your writing world?
They're going pretty good, actually. I'm up in Edinburgh at the moment for the Edinburgh Fringe. So it's kind of, it's very artsy. It's very busy up here. And the plan is that I'm going to do some writing while I'm up here. We'll see how that works out. I'll probably be too distracted to, but that's the plan at least. And then we're coming up to the release of my second book, Merge at the Matinee. And while that's coming out, book number 3 is sort of underway too.
Wow.
But I'm also working on something that's more like a modern kind of standalone crime thriller as well. So I'm kind of busy. And like I said, if I don't get distracted by everything that's going on up here, I might actually get some work done. You never know.
Yeah, you're sort of, in the perfect place to do it, hopefully. With all that artistic creativity bouncing around, who knows? But there's loads of stuff going on there then, lots and lots of books. Well, let's start off by talking about the one that's about to come out as we record this, Murder at the Matinee. Tell us a little bit about that.
So in Death on the Pier, in the first book, Bertie ends up getting tangled up with a murder that happens during one of his productions in front of an unsuspecting audience full of witnesses. But in Murder at the Matinee, it's the threat of a murder on a rival playwright's production that he ends up getting involved in. And Bertie and Hugh, who's an old school friend and very conveniently happens to be a police detective at Scotland Yard, they get thrown a little awkwardly back together again in order to solve another murder and the mystery of this strange newspaper advertisement that precedes it. And in the advert, it says that a murder will take place in the third act of this play, the only problem being that there is no murder in the third act of the play. And then that's kind of what sets everything off for him. And the investigation begins.
And away we go. So what was the kind of jumping off point for this particular book? Do you remember where the idea or ideas kind of formed?
I honestly don't really know. The first book took place at the Palace Pier Theatre in Brighton, which is a theatre that's now lost. And this second one takes place at the Gaiety Theatre in London, which is also another lost theatre. It doesn't exist anymore. It got demolished. And I knew I wanted to set a book there because of its location at the end of the Strand and its relationship with another kind of lost theatrical location, you might say, which is Romano's restaurant, where a lot of the theatrical trade used to dine in between shows. So for this one, it was the location that came first. And not to give too much away, but there's a kind of architectural feature of that building, shall we say, that inspired the method of the murder. So that kind of brought the location and the idea for the murder together. So I guess that was kind of the jumping off point, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. So tell us a little bit more about your hero, Bertie. Where did, obviously this is a series, so you would come up with him for the first book. Where did kind of Bertie emerge from?
It's funny because the whole lot arrived for me at once in a way. It was as soon as I discovered there was a theatre in Brighton that was lost. And as soon as I discovered there was a theatre on the end of the pier, everything kind of arrived at once. The idea of a murder mystery playwright turned detective, his an old school friend being a police detective, even the men of murder and who did it arrived in one boot, which is kind of, I think,
Brilliant.
quite unusual, I think.
Yeah.
But we've had all different manners of amateur sleuths, haven't we? Illusions designers, crossword puzzle setters, all these different kind of amateur sleuths that know how to unravel a puzzle. And I'm sure there's probably been a playwright as well. But to me, it seemed like a fun way into these murders, seeing if someone who comes up with impossible murders for a living in his plays, whether he can actually solve them as well.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And as you say, because of when the book is set and everything, you can't kind of very influenced by the golden age of mystery fiction. And for people that there'll be people that are listening to this that probably doesn't mean that much to them, but just kind of explain what that genre is and what it is that kind of drew you to it. And have you got particular authors or favorite examples from that?
Well, for me, the obsession with that kind of golden age style actually came from TV shows, obviously stuff like Poirot and Marple, but especially even the more modern murder mystery kind of counterparts like Jonathan Creek, especially shows
I
like Death
love
in
Jonathan
Paradise, even.
Creek. Yeah, it's
Um,
great.
it's great, isn't it? And it really captures the kind of puzzle mystery element of golden age fiction, and I think that's an important part of that type of fiction is there has to be that kind of puzzle aspect of it. I think often in modern crime books, it's not always about the mystery. Sometimes from the beginning, you might know who did it and how they did it quite early on. And the tension from those books comes from, are they going to get caught or not? We'll be able to get them. Whereas in the Golden Age style book, the tension comes, simply from not knowing who done it the whole time until the very end. And I suppose in terms of authors, obviously Agatha Christie, of course, and her plays as well, I'm quite a big fan of, which you won't be surprised to hear, I suppose. But also she has modern counterparts that do kind of well-clued puzzle mysteries like Tom Hindle, Anthony Horowitz. They've got clues in them in that kind of modern golden age tradition.
Yeah, brilliant. And as you say, it's kind of ripe for, and especially with nowadays, a lot of this stuff has kind of almost come back into fashion to a certain extent, hasn't it? Especially with cozy crime as well, which is kind of, I guess, an offshoot of that in some ways. So, what in terms of writing a good mystery, have how do you go about that? Do you kind of know the solution before you start writing, or and then you can lay your red herrings, or does it vary different from book to book? Obviously, the second book's coming out, but you've already mentioned you're kind of a good way along with the third book and you're doing something else. So talk us through that.
There's kind of two schools of thought on this, aren't there? I've heard other authors often say if I don't know the murderer while I'm writing it, then the audience won't be able to get, the readers won't be able to guess either. But for me, I have to know who did it because I think there always has to be a sense of inevitability about who did it. I think, when you get to that solution, and the Christie was, I mean, when she was at her best, she was very good at this, is when the murderer gets revealed, there's no other person it could have been. You finally get all the information. It's like, oh, of course, it had to be that person,
Yeah.
as opposed to just picking one of eight suspects. It could have been any of them. So I think for me, that's why I have to know beforehand. But I think even if you do it the other method, even if you sort of make it up as you go along and don't decide until later on, you can still go back and put that kind of sense of inevitability in the only way it could have been done in. But yeah, I always think a good mystery always has a satisfying ending. And for me, I don't go out of my way to try and trick the reader in any way. It's not a competition. I'm not trying to win because for me as a reader, sometimes there's a bit of satisfaction when you do work out a bit of the puzzle, not all of it, but you might work out who did it, but not or why and all those things. So yeah, I think it's important to have that kind of satisfaction when you get to the end of a book, however that kind of resolves.
Yeah, because like one of my pet peeves used to be, particularly with certain TV programs that kind of set themselves up as a mystery. And then when you find out the solution, you could never have guessed it. It's somebody that's completely alien to the plot. They're often a stranger that you didn't even know existed. And they just come in and it always just felt like totally cheating to me.
Yeah, it's like there can be a twist and there can be a reveal, of course, but when there's a load of information that you only get right at the end, that
Yeah.
almost feels like a bit of a cheat, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. So you kind of alluded to it, but you obviously, and you're up in Edinburgh at the moment, and you've worked backstage for many years on loads of well-known plays and musicals, and a lot of that has obviously gone into these books. What is it that you love about that world, and what made you want to bring that to the page?
What I mean, I'm a big fan of history that I can actually see. Do you know what I mean? I
Yeah,
was never
yeah,
really into historical stuff at school or history at school. It kind of didn't interest me. But when you're working in these buildings, which are, in themselves historic, some of them are over 100 years old. I don't think, I mean, I can't anyway. You can't help but wonder who was here before me? What are the stories of the shows or the people who used to work here? And a lot of the
Mhm.
time in theatre, it's literally written on the walls. There'll be leftover bits of metal work sticking out walls from a show from 20 years ago. People sign their names with dates on the walls and the shows they've worked on. It's all kind of there for you to see. Even I remember I worked at the London Palladium, which was one of my first jobs years and years ago. That famous triple revolve that used to feature at the end of Sunday night at the London Palladium,
Yeah.
that got removed, I think, in the early to or mid 2000s. And it's all been refurbished down there. It's all brand new substage, but you can still see there's still kind of a raised shadow of where the revolve used to run. So the history of these buildings is still kind of very prominent and very obvious. And there's actually, I mean, there's even people working in these theatres still that have been there for 40 years and they have stories to tell as well. So, I think you really just sort of pick up all of this stuff, and it all goes straight into the books.
And it's almost like they're suggesting mysteries. They're kind of there's lots of mystery in there, as you say. You've got a lot of these bits and pieces that are left behind. These little bits of evidence, if you like, of a past that you can can only dream about, or you can research anyway and try to find out about it.
Yeah, and a lot of it doesn't really exist. There's not a lot of records of a lot of shows, especially from the past, because they were very transient, very quick. They'd be there for, 12 weeks. Back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was considered, a very long run for a show. Whereas like nowadays, obviously stuff runs for years at a time. And it was all kind of disposable. Your play would go on for a few weeks, the set would be taken back, be painted over, the costumes would be recycled for the next show, and nothing was really, there aren't a huge number of records. So a lot of the history of theatre, even though a lot of stuff does exist in places like the V&A and some other collections around the UK, a lot of theatre itself is kind of a mystery to be unravelled.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's take a bit of a step back then. Just tell us a little bit about how you came to writing in the first place. Do you remember sort of your earliest memories of writing? What are your earliest memories of writing and books and things?
Well, it's funny. I always thought I would become a playwright. So let's not read too much into the character of Bertie and his profession. Um, but when I was at college, I used to write some like little plays and short scenes for the other students to perform. And quite ambitiously, at the end of the second year, I wrote a full length musical for everyone to perform. Um, but I think whatever you do, whether it's theatre, film, TV, novels, they all have a kind of shared ancestor, and that's just being a storyteller. And I think we all enjoy doing that. I think we all know someone who's great at telling stories in person. When they tell them, you're hanging off their every word, they just kind of form off the cuff. And it's like, I don't have that ability, unfortunately. I can't really do it. But with writing, you get your chance to go back and polish and say what you actually meant. So in a way, you're kind of capturing that same type of performance of in-person storytelling, but in words, which I'm far more comfortable doing anyway.
Yeah, and that's brilliant. And so, do you? Was it quite? Were you quite young when you first started? Getting that urge to kind of tell stories, as you say, you thought you were going to be, well, you wanted to be a playwright initially, which, by the way, you still can be, Jamie.
Yeah, I still could be. That's true. That's true. You never know. You never know.
You
I
might
think,
get to adapt one of your books.
yeah, fingers crossed. Some extra royalties would be great. Um, yeah, I guess because at college I would have been, how old are you at college? 16, 17, 18, maybe.
Yeah, yeah,
So kind of, like I said, that kind of storytelling urge was obviously there from a young age. But I sort of, I ended up going to drama school to do stage management and technical theatre, and I fell into a job in the West End very luckily, and I've worked backstage ever since. And it's sort of, even though I toyed with it over the years, it kind of fell away until, much later in life where I am now, where I sort of had the urge to do it again. And obviously, writing a novel felt like a really easy way, not easy way, because it's very hard writing a novel, but you don't need anything to write a novel other than a laptop. You don't need actors, you don't need choreographers, you don't need all this extra stuff. You can just do it. And when you've finished, you've got the finished article.
Totally agree. It's obviously it's a double-edged sword. There's also nobody else to blame, but you have to take the rough with the smooth, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. But then I always say it's like, even because obviously doing a novel is still quite collaborative. You're still working with
Yeah.
editors and proofreaders and stuff, and you get to take the credit when they make your work look and sound really good. You also get to take the credit from that because it's your name on the front of the book. So yeah, it's works both ways, doesn't it?
It does. It does. So obviously, you just talk us through when the first book that you actually got published. Was that the first book that you wrote, or the first book that was written to completion? Talk us through your actual path to publication.
It was the first one I probably finished. I remember I did start another book and it's
Yeah.
terrible, and you learn from it. So I specifically started out writing, I think it was like a spy novel. I can't really remember. But it didn't go anywhere because I wasn't really passionate about the story. It just didn't, it wasn't happening. And then I just thought, this other one that I've got the story for, it's in the sort of area that I work in. I was like, yeah, let's do that one. And it was much easier because, like all of these things, when you're writing from your own experience, it's got a kind of authenticity that makes it quite easy to get out on paper. So yeah, I was just like, let's just do the one that I'm excited about, basically. And originally, once it was done, I did send it out to agents, get it queried, all of those things. Um, and I got some great feedback actually from a lot of agents and some other people. It was really interesting to read what they had to say. But ultimately, it didn't get picked up by anyone. And I remember setting myself a cutoff date. I was like, if in January this doesn't get picked up by an agent, I'd been looking at the process of what I'd do if I wanted to publish it myself. And I sort of, as it approached that date, I sort of had my fingers crossed, the opposite of most authors, actually. I sort of had my fingers crossed going, oh, I hope it doesn't get picked up by an agent, because I was really excited now about the process of going about publishing it myself, because I've kind of got a bit of a business head. I quite like that side of things.
Mhm.
You know, I like, quite unusually probably, I like a good business plan and a bit of budgeting and all those things. So yeah, it got to the point and I was just like, I was quite excited about doing it. So yeah, luckily it wasn't picked up by anyone and I got to go about doing it myself. The first book came out in October 2022. So it took, what's that? Yeah, about 10 months to kind of get it properly edited and proofread and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff,
Yeah.
to make it the best it can be. Because I always think, you can do the best marketing in the world and convince people to pick up the book in the first place. But if the book's not presented well, it's not any good, it's going to be impossible to get them to pick up the second one after that, isn't it? So yeah.
Totally agree that there's a saying, isn't it, that the best marketing for your book is the book, if you know what I mean. Because as you say, it's like you can get it into a certain amount of people's hands or whatever, but if they read that and they absolutely hate it, then it's not going to go much further than that.
Yeah, as I say, you've only got one chance to make your debut, and if that book is no good, that's you've blown it, really, haven't you?
It can feel like that, yeah, definitely. I definitely agree. So what do you think? So in terms, obviously, you that was brilliant. You got through and you made it to publication and everything. What was the biggest misconception people have about traditional publishing? I guess you'd say the publishing process. Do you think? And how did you have misconceptions? And if so, how have your impressions of it changed since becoming published?
Well, I think I was reading someone on Threads today earlier, and they were saying, "Oh, everyone seems so negative about the publishing process sometimes." But for me, the entire experience has been, overwhelmingly positive, actually.
Hmm.
But I think what a lot of people don't realize, especially with traditional publishing, is what a lottery it can be in a way. And I see it in my profession with actors doing auditions quite a lot. You
Yeah.
can be the best actor in the world, you can be perfect for the part, and you can be a great singer. But when it comes to putting on a show, there's a larger vision that you're trying to slot all these actors into, and that has to make sense. It's not just about the individual. So if you don't get a job as an actor, it's not because you're bad at it. You're just not right to fit into that larger picture. And of course, that's still really tough if you're a jobbing actor and you need a job.
Hmm.
But I think there's more of a broader understanding of that's how things work in the theatre. Whereas when it comes to authors, I think sometimes we don't always realize there is a larger picture involved. And when your book doesn't get picked up by an agent, we're often like, oh, I can't believe they don't want my book. But
Hmm.
again, a bit like actors, it doesn't really come down to the talent of the author in this case. There is a larger picture for agents that have other books that they're representing, other authors that might be similar.
Yeah.
The same with the publisher, depending on what kind of book they're looking for. Are they looking for a book they think can sell in its millions or just its thousands, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, the whole thing just comes down to good luck and timing. If your book happens to land on an agent's desk or a publisher's desk at the exact same time, they happen to be looking for something just like that, then boom, you're in, you've won.
Yeah.
And I think for all of that to come together at the right moment and for authors to have the success that I think they expect, it really can be almost the same odds as winning the lottery. And, I don't get angry each week when I don't win the lottery. So I think,
I
we
do.
shouldn't get angry at the publishing industry.
No, actually, that's a really good analogy, especially with acting and that particular industry, because as you say, that's kind of just taken as a given. I mean, I think there is an element of it. I mean, I think anybody that's been writing and submitting for any period of time realizes that rejection is a part of the industry. But that doesn't necessarily always make it any easier, does it, to kind of deal with? And even people that once you get picked up, whether that's with an agent or whether you actually get to sell your book and it goes to a publisher or whatever, there's still more rejection often waiting down the road in various other things. Your second book might not get picked up, or they don't like the pitch for the second book or the third book or whatever it might be, and all those other things that can kind of come up along the way as well. You kind of have to be resilient, don't you?
Yeah, it's really tough. And like I said, with actors, you often see the same person, they'll be called back, 15, 20 times for a role. And, that relentless kind of unrelentless drive of auditioning, performing, is incredibly draining. And I think, for authors, it's the same thing, that constant kind of sending out to yet another agent. It is a grind and it can wear you down. But I think you've just got to understand that's just part of it. And actually, like I said, when I was sending stuff out to agents, I really enjoyed getting the rejections because they often would come with genuine advice. They often would
Yeah,
come
yeah,
with something, they have actually read these 3 chapters
yeah.
and they've said, it's only a sentence or something, but they have given comment on it. And that was, for me, that was again like a really positive experience. Someone's read my 3 chapters. It was fantastic.
So tell us a little bit about your process. Obviously, you've mentioned you're kind of on the third book that you're writing at the moment, and you've got this other book that's kind of in the wing, waiting in the wings to stay on brand with what we're talking about. And so, obviously, that's a few books now. Tell us a little bit about your process and how, if at all, has it changed since you had that first book? Have you changed the way you do things at all?
It stayed actually broadly similar. I think I've got this huge Apple Note, and every idea I've ever had is in there. And every now and then I'll scroll through it, and there's some ones that might jump out at me. I'm like, oh, that is good. That is a good one. And there's some terrible ones that I leave in there. I don't get rid of them. I leave all the terrible ones in there as well.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, once I've sort of found something from that note, and both the next 2 books in the Bertie Carroll series, and actually this other one I'm kind of playing around with, they both came out of that note. They were just sort of scrolling through one day, and the idea jumped out at me, and I was like, oh, that's the one. Let's get going. And then I sort of just start in a way. I'm not a big outliner. I don't want to write a load of stuff that's not the book. So I just sort of get started. What I do generally do is make a bunch of nonsense chapter headings that will never make it into the book. They're things like Bertie and Hugh go to the theatre or Bertie finds a clue. Like they're very
Yeah.
boring, not interesting things. But when you've got it all out in the list, you can sort of see the kind of overall arc of this story and sort of more importantly, check that there's enough there for a book. You know, if there's only 10 chapters, there's not really enough here for a book. It needs a bit more work. But if you've got a whole load of chapters, you're like, yeah, this is great. And then I just sort of start. And it starts off quite sketchy, really. I think there's two different types of writers, I think, anyway. There's sculptors and painters. And sculptors, you generate a load of material at the beginning. It's like just having a big hunk of clay that you sort of bash roughly into position. And then you carve away at it and remove material to reveal the final book. It's like, starting with 200,000 words and ending with a book that's 100,000 words.
Hmm.
And like I said, I'm quite lazy. So I consider myself more a painter, where you sort of start with a pencil sketch and then you add a bit of color and then you add a bit more detail and you sort of slowly build up from nothing to get to the final book rather than cut away at a load of material to get to it. So that's kind of what I do to get a book. And it takes a few passes before I get to that first draft. And then once I get to that first draft, then it's, the normal drafting, editing process. And I think about 5 or 7 drafts in, then it's kind of ready to go.
Hmm. And then you're about there. And do
Yeah.
you with that kind of building it up and that sketching and painting as you describe it, do you ever get stuck during the first draft or find yourself battling with the dreaded self-doubt? And if so, how do you deal with that? Because I know that that's a really big thing for most writers.
Well, for me, like that self doubt kind of manifests almost as embarrassment in a way when you're sitting in a room and, you know, you've got to get over the embarrassment of typing away at a keyboard and making stuff up. I can sort of, once I've got that, I'm away and I can keep going then. But because my writing process is quite light in those first few passes, I know I can just sort of keep going. If I know what needs to happen, then I might do a chapter that's just a load of scene description, and it might only be 200, 300 words, but it's a chapter. It sort of contains everything I need it to,
Sort of
and then
like
I
a
can add to
blueprint
it.
almost.
Yeah, exactly. I can add to it later on. Or if I know what I need people to say, I'll just do a load of dialogue, almost like a script. And then I kind of go back in a bit like a director, I suppose, to keep it theatrical
Hmm.
and sort of stage the scene later. But I know I've got all the dialogue in there that I need the people to say. So, yeah, it can be quite loose. And because of that, you can kind of just keep pushing through. You don't have to worry about it looking or sounding like a book for those first few passes.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that about dialogue. I never really thought about that, but that is something that I do probably unconsciously almost with dialogue. I like writing dialogue, and I think probably to find my characters sometimes I find once I find how they talk, I suddenly realize who the character is, if that makes sense. And maybe because similar to you, I kind of started off writing scripts, so maybe that's where that comes from. But I think that's a good way to do it. I think once you know how people talk, the cadence of the sentences and the vocabulary and everything else, I think that tells you a lot about the character, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. A lot. I might describe what they're wearing, but yeah, I don't put a lot of what color hair they've got or what color eyes they've got because it's just I don't imagine those things at all. I can't see them,
Yeah, yeah.
which is kind of funny.
I'm a bit like that when I read, though, to be honest. I often find if I read a book that's got lots of description without realizing it, I find myself almost not completely skipping it, but speed reading it almost, sort of skim reading it over it because that I'm just waiting to get to the next bit of action or dialogue or whatever.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, I think the reader themselves brings a lot of that stuff with them.
Yeah.
And that makes the book even more personal to whoever's reading, even more unique to the person that's reading it. And of course, that's why, whenever something gets adapted for TV or film, that's when we get the arguments about what people should look like and how people imagine them. Because, of course, in a book, we all imagine, if 100 people read a book, we all imagine it 100 different ways. So, yeah, it must be tough casting these things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of the magic of books. And on that subject, a segment that I do on here is
It's the book. It's the book that saved my life. Saved my life. Yeah, it's the book. It's the book that saved my life.
the book that saved your life. So if I said that to you, obviously not being literal, or maybe it is, sometimes it can be, it could surprise me. Maybe it was a book on CPR. But if I said that to you, what does that kind of conjure up? Is there a particular book or books that spring to mind if I talk about the book that saved your life?
It's fun. Like as a kid, I remember reading a lot of non-fiction books, really, and particularly the Argos catalogue, bizarrely.
Oh yeah,
and
me
also
too.
and also the Viking catalogue, which is like office stationery. I know people are into
Yeah.
notebooks and stuff and nice notebooks, but I mean, I still am. I'm really into printing supplies, bizarrely.
Yeah.
I really like it. But in terms of the book that I still remember and the book I think had the most impact on me is a book called K-Pax, which I think is by Gene Brewer. It's an American. And I think it was at that, up until then, any books that I read or were read to me were stories. I knew that they were kind of made up. But this K-Pax book, because I think it was written in the first person, it's said in the front based on a true story, whatever that means. We know that's kind of a meaningless phrase these days.
Yeah, yeah.
But because of that, it was the first book that I felt really immersed in. I felt like this was something that is happening or was happening, rather than it just being a tale that I was being spun. And like we were just saying, the real magic of books is that they are truly immersive experiences, much more so than AI goggles or 3D glasses, which are always just kind of tricking your senses.
Mm.
Books are the only form, I think, of entertainment that is, completely immersive and asks everything of the reader and their imagination. And I can't even remember if it's a good book or not. I can't really remember much of the details of the plot, but I just know it was an important book for that reason, because I think it was, yeah, like I say, the first time that I found myself completely immersed in this book and in this world that was created in the book.
Fantastic. Is that the book? Was that made into a film?
Yeah,
Apex?
it was with Kevin Spacey, I think.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, it's sort yeah, I remember liking the film at the time. It's kind of got a bit of a sci-fi tinge to it, hasn't it? Or a possible sci-fi tinge to it, if I
Yeah,
remember rightly.
that's the thing I just couldn't wrap my head around, because it's like based on a true story and it's set in a psychological ward or something. And
That's it. Yeah.
this guy, I think, thinks he's from space, but sometimes he does actually disappear, and it's all very, yeah, you're like, is this real, isn't it? And I mean, I suppose that's probably the point. You're not sure
Yeah.
whether this is just another patient or if it is actually someone from outer space. And yeah, I just remember completely, yeah, buying into it and not really understanding whether it was real or not, basically.
Yeah, but it's obviously transported you somewhere and got you more into reading and books and everything.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so as you've kind of been along the way, and this might be writing related, but it might not be equally. You're in an artistic field yourself, working in theatre. What's the best piece of creative advice that you've been given along the way, or that springs to mind?
Well, the best piece of advice that I always bear in mind, anyway, it's actually from another podcast I listen to called Script Notes.
Yeah, good
It's
podcast.
Yeah, it's by like two Hollywood screenwriters, and I've got no ambitions really to be a screenwriter or anything, but a lot of the stuff they talk about on that, about characters and story, it's relevant to writers of all kinds. It's yeah, really interesting podcast. But their advice that has kind of stuck with me is that you shouldn't be too precious about where you work. If you can only write in your perfect writing shed or with the perfect desk set up with, the scented candles you like and what have you, all that stuff, you're really limiting yourself to when you can actually work, and the times you can do it. For most of us that have full-time jobs, that writing time is really, really precious. And I think the example they gave was, when you're on a set, and the film's being made and you need to do a quick rewrite, you can't just travel all the way home to your perfect desk setup. You're going to have to go and sit in a corner of a soundstage on a cold concrete floor, huddled over your laptop, and you're going to need to be able to do the best work of your life. I try and write during breaks at work when I can, and really try and exercise that muscle of being able to switch in and out of writing quickly, so I can make the most of my time wherever I am. So if I need to work in a coffee shop or when I'm traveling, hopefully I'll be able to do that. Like I said, I'm up at the Edinburgh Festival right now, and it's very distracting and it's not quite working. But that's certainly the idea. And I think, that kind of stuck with me, especially because, like I said, our writing time, for a lot of people, writing isn't a full-time job, even when they're very successful. So you really have to be able to, anytime you can write, you've really got to make use of it, haven't you?
Yeah, I totally agree. That's brilliant advice. And I think you're right. I think too many times, especially when you kind of have this dream in your mind that, one day I'll be a full-time writer and, I'll be up in this French garret or something, and I'll have all this perfect time with a lovely view, and there's interruptions and everything else. So the more you can just grab the time when you can and make the most of it, the better.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, I'm an incredibly lazy person. So if there is an excuse not to write, I will take it. I will not do anything.
That's like most of us, to be fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I often find myself suddenly got a desire to tidy the house, which I never do any other time except when I'm supposed to be doing some words. So I feel you there. And just as we kind of wrap things up, just tell people where they can find out more about you and your work online, and also social media and all that stuff.
So I'm Jamie West Author everywhere: TikTok, Threads, Instagram. And then if you go to jamiewestauthor.co.uk, I've got a bit of a website there. I've kind of got a newsletter, but I don't really send it out regularly. I only send it out when there's something to announce, like a new book.
Yeah.
I kind of love interacting with. It's important to me as an author that I'm not just shouting about my own books. I really kind of enjoy, especially on Instagram, interacting with all the other bookstagrammers and the books they're talking about. It's a really fun community on there. And then on TikTok, I often post little videos every now and then, which take a lot longer to make than you would think.
I know that's the funny thing about those things. Yeah,
exactly. I often post little videos about kind of theatre history sometimes, which are just little things that interest me. So yeah, that's why I kind of around on TikTok.
Brilliant. So there's loads of stuff to go out there. Well, I'll make sure I put all that stuff in the show notes. But for now, Jamie, it's been great to chat to you. Good luck with the book. And thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the success of the first book was really down to, bloggers and Instagrammers and going on podcasts like this. So yeah, I really appreciate joining you and having the time on your podcast.
Joined Up Writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Jamie, and I'll put all of his links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk and also on whichever platform you're listening to this on. That's it for this week, other than me reminding you to drop me a line at wayne@waynekellywrites.com to tell me what you want to see in future shows. And obviously don't forget to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you want to get your podcasts from. And that way you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every time an episode drops. Also remember to leave us a nice rating and review on whichever platform you listen to this on, because it does help other people to find the show, and just keep recommending it to your pals. That would be marvellous. So thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.